Are in Acts chapter 27, right at the beginning. We're down to the last two chapters of Acts. So today I think we can probably get through all of 27, and then that our next session in probably 2 weeks, we should be able to finish. So, just to kind of recap, it's since Paul finished his third missionary journey, and he headed back to Jerusalem with a collection from the churches he founded in what is now Turkey and Greece. He heads back to offer this for the poor in Judea to the Jerusalem church. So he gets there and he makes his way to Jerusalem and meets immediately with the leaders of the church in Jerusalem. And James, the bishop of Jerusalem at the time, tells him, we get the sense that Paul has his reputation is checkered, let's say. There's suspicion that he has abandoned the traditions of Judaism and that he is teaching others to abandon the traditions of Judaism. So James is kind of trying to give Paul an opportunity to correct that misperception and to kind of rehabilitate his image, we might say now. And so he says, well, look, we got 4 guys who are going to the temple to take Nazirite vows. This is Jewish tradition. And if you were to be their sponsor to take on the costs associated with performing this ritual in the temple, and you yourself go there to complete the days of purification after you've returned from Gentile lands, this will look good. The people will see you participating in these traditional practices, and it'll help dispel this idea that you are degrading or insulting the Jewish tradition. So Paul does this, but unfortunately the plan seems to backfire, because when he goes into the temple area, he encounters, because now they're in this period they're approaching Pentecost. So they're in this period where a lot of Jews who lived overseas would often make this trip for Passover, and then, especially if they'd made a long trip, just stay the 50 days so that they could hit the second of the 3 big major pilgrimage festivals and stay for Pentecost. So they see him, these Jews particularly from Ephesus in Asia Minor, modern day Turkey, see him in the temple, recognize him because Paul had a tumultuous stay in Ephesus. He was there about 2 years and caused no little amount of trouble, which we read about in earlier chapters. So they recognize him. There's this troublemaker. Now he's shown up here. And so they start making problems for him, and a riot kind of breaks out when Paul's in the temple precincts. And the charge against him, supposedly the rumor starts flying quickly that he brought a Gentile, a non-circumcised Gentile, a Christian, but one who had never been Jewish, into the temple. There's no evidence that that's actually true, but it was the only charge that the Roman authorities allowed the Jews to act on their own, for which they had any authority. Because this was an internal matter. And the penalty was the death penalty. This was what was posted around the temple precinct. So they try to, this riot kind of breaks out in the temple precincts, and they're about to tear him limb from limb when the Roman soldiers and the garrison adjoining the temple precincts see it. They go grab him out, because their job is peace and order, stability. So it's easier to grab the one guy rather than the big mob. So they grab him out to kind of separate it, restore order. And then, so you could say they saved Paul, but their intention was to go beat him themselves in order to find out what's going on here. What'd you do? So he's saved from one beating where they're probably going to kill him, and to a beating where they're going to interrogate him and figure out what's going on here, what's the problem. But that's when he stops, and he kind of develops this rapport with the Roman commander, the centurion. And he tries to give a speech there from the steps to calm people down. Doesn't really work. Finally, they realize that he tells them he's a Roman citizen, which changes the whole equation. And then you enter in a period where he's basically stuck for the next 2 years in what we might call house arrest or protective custody. So he's kept in the barracks there in Jerusalem for the next 2 years while the authorities try to figure out what to do with him. And then this is complicated, or this period is elongated by the fact that there's a change in the Roman governor. So the new Roman governor comes in. He can't figure out what's going on. The previous governor was probably keeping him in there, waiting for a bribe. And then so the new governor comes in and seems to be a little bit more fair and just, and he's just trying to figure out, why is this guy here? What's the charge? So anyway, that's where we are. In the previous section, the new Roman governor, as he's installed, he receives an official visit from King Agrippa II. And he says, oh, this is a great opportunity. Here's someone who's knowledgeable about internal Jewish matters. Maybe he can hear this Paul guy out, not in an official hearing or trial, but hear his story. And maybe he can suss out what it is, what's all the hubbub about, so that I have something to write to Caesar to explain why I'm sending him. So what happens there in that kind of hearing, although not in an official way, Paul speaks and directs his comments mainly to Agrippa. And at the end of it, Agrippa kind of jokes, that Paul is trying to convert him, that, Paul saw all of these opportunities to get an audience before powerful political figures. He saw them as opportunities, that this was his purpose, actually. It was to preach to these people. And so, Agrippa kind of makes this joke, and we're not really exactly sure how to take it about, you came close to converting me, something like that. And then Agrippa turns to the new Roman governor and basically says, I got nothing, I don't know why. I really don't know why he's being held. And he says, if he hadn't appealed to Caesar already, he probably would be freed already. So, this kind of gives us the indication that they're really not sure what the charges are against him, either from a Jewish perspective or from the Roman law perspective. All right. So anyway, that was kind of the previous section. And now they're going to send him off. They really have no choice because he's made this appeal to Caesar, which is his right as a Roman citizen. They really don't have any choice but to send him as following the protocol. So we begin in chapter 27 here. This is Paul's journey to Rome, which, we heard in an earlier chapter that this is his purpose. He must appear before Caesar in order to present the gospel to Caesar. All right, so here's a map. All right, and we see, if you can all see this. So starting out here, he was in Jerusalem. The main port, and as well as the seat of the Roman governor, is Caesarea Maritima. So he's up there, and then he sails from there. He boards a ship, and we'll hear the details in a second. And he's going to make his way to Rome. But this voyage, as he goes to Rome, now remember, up until this point, he'd taken what we call three missionary trips. But in all those missionary trips, he had really stayed here around just encircling the Aegean Sea. He had never ventured further west than Varia here in Greece, Macedonia. So, but his goal is to get all the way over here. So that's another stage. That's a long journey. All right. So here it takes off. So verse 1, 27 verse 1. And when it was decided that we should sail to Italy. Now, first of all, let's notice here, it says we. So again, we're back to the we passages. So the we passages, as we've discussed before, drop in and out of the narrative here in Acts. So the last time we heard the we passage was back in chapter 21. The we dropped out. And that was when Paul comes to Jerusalem with some representatives of his churches, which includes St. Luke. So St. Luke, we believe, was with him if we take the position that these we passages are Luke's notes. So, and then we don't hear about Luke. So what has Luke been doing the last 2 years while Paul's been held in this protective custody in the Jerusalem area? Well, it's reasonable to suspect that he's just kind of found his own lodging to be near Paul. We know that this house arrest, protective custody, since he was a Roman citizen, they allowed Paul to receive visitors, so they could come in, they could take care of his needs, bring him food, they could come and help him write letters, etc. So Luke has probably just been in the area to be of service to Paul. But here he goes back to what looks like travel notes. So it looks like the we passages are tied with travel and a kind of maybe journal, a travel journal that Luke or someone with him kept, and it contains a lot of details about the travel. So here, and that we might say, well, all right, Paul's a prisoner. He's being shipped to Rome as a prisoner. Okay, how is it that Luke gets to go with him? All right, well, we'll see this in a second. So, and when it was decided that we should sail to Italy, they delivered Paul and some other prisoners. So we don't know who these other prisoners are, but it would be hard to imagine they were also all Roman citizens. So probably at least some of these prisoners are being sent to Rome basically as fodder for the games, for the gladiatorial games. So they would be sent, basically they're on the way to be executed as a spectacle by armed gladiators or lions or whatever. So these then wouldn't be Roman citizens, but just condemned prisoners. So they delivered Paul and some other prisoners to one named Julius, a centurion of the Augustan regiment. So the Augustan regiment was a title that was bestowed on sometimes more than one regiment, and it kind of rotated depending on who was being deployed, but it indicated that it belonged to the emperor. And so after you had the emperor, you had the imperial guard close to the emperor, but after the imperial guard, probably the next kind of most elite unit would be whatever they named the Augustan regiment. So these would be this would be an elite military unit that would have a great deal of respect. So, and Julius is a centurion of the Augustan regiment. And we notice here that throughout Luke in particular, in the Gospel of Luke and in Acts, that the centurions, Roman centurions, who are kind of these officers like captains, something like that, middle officers, they're almost always portrayed as very fair and open to the Christians. So it's interesting why that would be the case. But anyway, all right. So basically what happened at this time is we gotta think at this time that things weren't so maybe clearly demarcated in terms of government services or roles. They didn't have enough rapid communication, et cetera, to have so many specialized units moving back and forth. So basically what happened is the Roman governor here kind of commandeers a section of an army unit that's in his area and says, hey, look, I have a mission. I need an officer and a few guys to carry something out for me. And they don't know exactly this Julius, what kind of position he had, but the kind of educated guess based on all the testimony is that he was actually what was called a frumentarius in Latin, meaning that he was responsible for safeguarding the transport of grain. So he would have been an officer so you had this kind of merchant fleet that was it was almost like a utility that of the Roman government that they had to regulate, but it was private. And it was these ships that would mainly be going back and forth between Alexandria, Egypt, where the wheat was grown, and the banks of the Nile in Rome. So taking wheat to Rome. And so it was such an important, it was the kind of the lifeblood. Wheat was the lifeblood of the Roman Empire. And so there was these military soldiers dedicated to kind of safeguarding its transport. So we think that he was something like that. All right, verse 2. So entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sail, meaning to sail along the coasts of Asia. All right, so let me show you here. So Adramyttium is somewhere up here near Troy in northwest modern day Turkey. All right, and the ship they get on down here is from there. So what these kind of ships were, I think we've talked about this before, that ships really weren't engineered well enough that they could just go straight across the open Mediterranean. They usually had to go along the shore. So in other words, this was a smaller ship that was going to be making its way around the shoreline all the way up the north, all the way up the west coast here of Turkey, all the way back to its home base. And so this was probably its normal run, would be around the coasts here. So they enter in this ship knowing that these kind of ships, they would stay close to shore and they would make frequent stops along the way. And they'd get here and then they would return. And they would get here and they would return. And they would just be carrying cargo back and forth. There really weren't just passenger ships. It was mainly cargo, and passengers could kind of get on board if there was room. All right, so entering a ship of Adramyttium, we put to sea, meaning to sail along the coast of Asia. Aristarchus, a Macedonian of Thessalonica, was with us. All right, so we know that Paul 2 years before had come with several representatives of local churches. Here we get the sense that Luke and this Aristarchus were ones who had stayed around Paul for the last 2 years while he was in this house arrest. 3, and the next day we landed at Sidon. Sidon was a kind of an old Phoenician city. And Julius treated Paul kindly and gave him liberty to go to his friends and receive care. So what does this mean? Like we saw in other stops during Paul's first 3 missionary journeys, he knew where these Christian communities were, and he would stop in if he was traveling by. So when it says to go to his friends and receive care, probably that's telling us that at Sidon there was a Christian community already, and we're probably here in the year 59. So in other words, this ship would make stops, and sometimes the stops would be 1, 2, 3, 4 days as they got cargo off, put cargo on. So they actually gave Paul liberty to go on land and stay with his friends. Now, probably they sent a soldier with him to keep him in this kind of protective custody. So verse 4, when we had put to sea from there, we sailed under the shelter of Cyprus because the winds were contrary. All right, so now in this, we're going to get, because it's this we section again, the travel diary, we're going to get lots and lots of technical travel information here about sailing. So in other words, what he's saying is, one way to go would have been to go like this, to go around the south part of Cyprus, but instead they go this way because of the winds. So at this time of year, and we believe that the time of year is around October at this point, the northwestern winds are the ones that predominate. All right, and when we had sailed over the sea, which is off Cilicia and Pamphylia, we came to Myra, a city of Lycia. So this might sound familiar to us, especially when we have services or liturgy in our chapel of St. Nicholas, because then we always commemorate St. Nicholas, who was bishop of Myra and Lycia. So right here. So in other words, he's saying, so they avoid the open sea, they sail in between the lands here, and staying close to the land or using islands had the effect of blocking these winds. So it made it easier for them to, and they're going west, they're actually going northwest, which is exactly the direction that the wind is coming from. So they're heading into opposing winds. And we're going to see here in a second, they're at a time of year when it was getting risky to travel. All right, so it seems like probably with difficulty, they make it to this point. So before they round this corner, so you have the northwest winds coming, they're still kind of protected here. Once they round this corner, the winds are really going to hit them. All right, verse 6. There, the centurion, Julius, found an Alexandrian ship sailing to Italy, and he put us on board. All right, so you understand what's happening here. The line doesn't show it, but this ship is stopping at various ports along the way. Finally, it gets to this port of Myra, which was an important port because, there was this huge grain trade from Alexandria to Rome. But sailing this way to Rome was considered a no-no. No one did that, because especially here you had these shoals that the ships, you know, they would try to sail maybe just under Crete, but if the winds pushed them into these shoals here, they would run aground and be shipwrecked. So the typical route always was Alexandria, you go north, straight north, and then you'd go west because you wanted to avoid this section. So a lot of the grain ships from Alexandria would come across here, boom, land here. So if, as our theory, speculation goes, Julius, the centurion, is actually an official, an officer in charge of grain transport, then he knows all this. And he's figuring that as they're stopping at these ports on this boat, that he can, and every time they stop, he can inquire what other boats are here and where they're going. And this is how the system worked. It was very kind of informal. And so as an officer, he had the ability, he represented the Roman government. It wasn't a government ship, none of these were, but he could commandeer basically a space on the ship. You know, just like we see in the movies now where, you know, a police officer commandeers someone's car and takes off on a chase or something like that. So he had that ability. So probably he finds out when they land here, oh, there is a ship, just came from Alexandria, it's heading to Rome. And he says, great. He goes to the captain and he says, look, I'm on official business. I need these prisoners. We're gonna be here. We're gonna ride on the ship with you. And then the question is like, so again, Luke and Aristarchus are traveling with Paul. It seems, at least up to this point. And either Julius, the centurion, would be able to get them in also just by saying, look, they're with us, or maybe more likely, they would just pay their way as normal passengers trying to find passage. So anyway, and then we don't hear, yeah. Oh, someone paused out. But we don't hear more about Aristarchus here after this point. So it may be that he takes a different ship and heads back to Thessaloniki, but we do know that Luke continues on with Paul after this point. All right, so. And he put, so here he says here, there the centurion found an Alexandrian ship sailing the other, and he put us on board. So might be indicating he got us on board by his fiat. Verse 7. When we had sailed slowly many days, remember, because they're coming out from under that protection, they're getting hit by that northwesterly wind that's opposing them, so it's slow sailing. When we had sailed slowly many days and arrived with difficulty off Cnidus, the wind not permitting us to proceed, we sailed under the shelter of Crete off Salmone. All right, so in other words, so they try to come off here, and they're gonna maybe try to stay close, go over here like this, but the winds, the northwest winds, pushing them down. Right, they're trying to go straight west, and they're pushing them down. So they decide, all right, let's give in, and let's just go underneath, south of Crete, so that the island will be a wind block for us. It'll block the wind, and we can make this westerly progress here. All right, so passing it with difficulty, we came to a place called Fair Havens near the city of Lasea. No, so they're on the south side of Crete. Verse 9. Now, when much time had been spent and sailing was now dangerous because the fast was already over, Paul advised them. All right, so let's unpack this. So, in other words, he's saying that a lot of time had been wasted, basically, is what it's telling us, because the sailing was going so slow. Much time had been spent. And why is this important? And because the fast was already over. So the fast they're referring to is Yom Kippur, the Jewish Day of Atonement. So, which would have been like a marker. So it's like us saying, you know, oh, we'll do that after the fast is over, you know, after Lent. So after the fast was over, the Day of Atonement. And so they've actually done some really interesting research on this. So we think the speculation is that they've gone back and looked in all these years around in the 50s AD, 60 AD, and to see when Yom Kippur fell in those years. And you know, only really 1 year in this range, the year 59, did Yom Kippur fall quite late. It fell on like October 5th. Normally it falls in September. So the fast was already over. So we think that we've pinpointed the likely year here to the year 59. the fast was already over, and meaning that we'd already entered into fall. And this particular year, it was on the late side. And the message that that's sending is that it was considered, there were certain sailing seasons when anybody who had any kind of sense in their head would sail. So summer was the time for safe travel, but then you'd have the fall and then the spring were kind of iffy. You would do so only if there was, really compelling reason. And then once you hit winter, forget about it. So like, I think around November 11th, something like that, nobody would sail for 3 months. Winter, forget about it. So what we think then here is that what he's saying is, if it's the year 59, the fast is already over. It's past October 5th. So they're probably in the middle of October. And the kind of, the summer season of good travel ended probably September 14th or thereabouts. So, they're about a month into this murky kind of area and about a month away from a hard close that you don't travel. So Paul advised them saying, verse 10, saying, "Men, I perceive that this voyage will end with disaster and much loss, not only of the cargo and ship, but also our lives." So he's warning them. It's not something they wouldn't have already been aware of. Everyone was aware that these were kind of treacherous periods, but probably the ship's owner, remember this is a private enterprise, he's got all this grain that needs to go to Rome. And, in these years, we know that the Romans, especially Emperor Claudius, had this program of incentivizing private merchanters to maybe do some dangerous things in order to get more grain to Rome, because for the Roman emperors at this time, bread and circus. So it's interesting. This ship is carrying wheat, and it's carrying probably prisoners who are going to be killed in the circus. And the bread and circus, if they could keep the people, the Roman poor, fed and happy with bread and circus, then they could breathe a sigh of relief. If they weren't able to provide those things, then they really need to start worrying about revolution, which no emperor likes. So so they would incentivize these ship captains to take some risks during these periods. So St. Paul says, hey guys, things aren't going well. We're not making hardly any progress at all. The winds are really bad. In other words, he's going to suggest we need to just dock somewhere for the winter and wait it out, which is what happened. 11, which is what would typically happen. 11, nevertheless, the centurion was more persuaded by the helmsman and the owner of the ship than by the things spoken by Paul. Okay, so they're very gun-ho to keep going because they have a financial incentive. 12, and because they don't know where this place is. They're on the south coast of Crete and Fair Havens, and they don't want to sit here for 3 months. So, all right, verse 12. And because the harbor was not suitable to winter in, to spend the winter in, so it was probably a smaller kind of port that couldn't offer enough protection, the majority advised to set sail. So this, in other words, this implies that there was some kind of ship's council that certain people, had the right to participate in the ship's council and to vote. So the majority advised to set sail from there also, if by any means they could reach Phoenix, a harbor of Crete opening toward the southwest and northwest, and winter there. So it was a better, bigger port. So they're here, kind of in the middle of southern Crete, and they say, well, all right, maybe you're right. Maybe we will have to spend the winter until the weather improves, but at least let's get over here to Phoenix. It's a much bigger harbor. There's probably more areas to find lodging, etc. It'll be better if we can, if we have to stop there. All right, verse 13. When the south wind blew softly, so the south wind was considered kind of a good wind coming out of Africa. It was like usually a warm wind. Even in Greece to today, they talk a lot about, people are very aware and sensitive to the different winds. When there's a southern wind coming, it usually brings warmth. It brings sand out of the Saharan desert up in the kind of atmosphere. When a northeasterly wind is a winter wind, which is the worst. It's it's very cold and biting. So people were very attuned to these winds in general, not just the sailors. And of course, there was the belief, as we've kind of talked about in the book study, that these winds were, this is just kind of an aside, but that just as the stars, the sun and the moon had spiritual beings attached to them, so the winds also were imagined to have a kind of spiritual component. The winds were controlled by or governed by, administered by these angelic spirits as well. So that, there was an element that it just wasn't chance that the winds operated in certain ways. There was a spiritual element to it. And then keep in mind too, the image of the sea is very different from ours. So in the Hebrew mind in particular, the water is chaos. The water is extremely dangerous. The water represents evil, chaos, disorder, danger, for the Hebrews in particular. But I think for all the ancient peoples, the sea was very dangerous. Not a lot of people at the time actually knew how to swim, although as strange as that seems. So it was considered very dangerous, ominous almost. But okay, so when the south wind blew softly, supposing that they had obtained their desire, so in other words, finally we caught a break, the winds have changed, they sailed close by Crete. But not long after, a tempestuous headwind arose called Euroclydon, which again was this kind of westerly, northwesterly, here they call it northeaster. Okay, yeah, the northeaster. So the most feared wind. So instead of northwestern, then they had a southern wind, which was good. They made some progress because that southern wind kept them close to the shore of southern Crete. But then this northeasterly wind that's particularly powerful hit them. 15. So when the ship was caught and could not head into the wind, we let her drive. And running under the shelter of an island called Clauda, we secured the skiff with difficulty. So this is this island, tiny little island about here called Clauda, just in the southwest of Crete. Again, they're using these islands as kind of wind blocks. And so, and then when he says, we secured the skiff with difficulty. So the skiff was like the lifeboat. And usually it was towed behind these bigger boats. And sometimes even a sailor would stay in it the whole time. And the purpose of it was not really so much like a lifeboat purpose, but especially these big ships, it would take anchors and place anchors. So the skiff would sometimes go ahead and plant an anchor, which would then help bring the boat into dock, or they would plant an anchor behind or to one side in order to help the boat stabilize. So, but the image we're getting here is that the waves were so tumultuous that this little skiff was probably getting filled with water, getting bounced all over the place. And so it was actually kind of slowing them down. And so they said, okay, we got to get it on board so that it's not just, pulling us one way or the other. And then when he says, we secured the skiff. So, he's a paid passenger. There's a crew of the ship. But when things got difficult like this and they needed like all hands on deck, even the passengers were called into service. So it's almost like you get this idea Luke is remembering, like, oh, man, we all had to run and pull and pull and pull and try to get the ship up. And he's like, remembering the blisters on his hands from pulling a rope. I mean, you didn't have to be a professional sailor to do things like that. They just told you, get over there right now and start pulling. All right, so things are bad. 17, when they had taken it on board, the skiff, they used cables to undergird the ship. All right, so what does that mean? So there were also these cables, because what was possible is the hull of the ship was made by these planks that were fastened together. But when the winds were, and when the wind and the waves were really violent, there was the possibility that what was fastening those planks together could actually just come apart. The planks could come apart, so they would slip. The boats were fitted with these cables that they could kind of slip over maybe the front of the ship and run it underneath and fasten it. So a cable would kind of, it's almost like, wrap, like you wrap your ankle or something like that. If you have a sprained ankle, to give it support, they would wrap the hull of the ship to keep those planks tight together so they wouldn't burst apart. Okay, and fearing lest they should run aground on the Syrtis sands, they struck sail and so were driven. All right, so in other words, so here they are. They're afraid at this point because there's a northeasterly wind now. You see they start heading this way, and this is exactly that place where the shoals are, where these shallow waters that a lot of ships trying to go this way get pushed into them and run aground. So you can see here the northeasterly wind is starting to take them into this danger zone. And because we were exceedingly tempest tossed, the next day they lightened the ship, 18. So in other words, they're trying to get the ship to ride high on the waves as much as possible. 19. On the third day, so in other words, they threw some cargo overboard. And this was probably hurt the ship's owner to see that some of that wheat go overboard. Verse 19, on the third day, we threw the ship's tackle overboard with our own hands. Again, with our own hands, meaning that even the passengers it was such a dangerous situation that even the passengers were kind of forced into service. And the tackle was like the riggings and stuff like that of the boat. So they threw that overboard to lighten the ship. 20, now when neither sun nor stars appeared for many days, and no small tempest beat on us, all hope that we would be saved was finally given up. So they couldn't, and remember, they navigated, they didn't have compasses and things like that. They navigated by the stars and the sun. So if it's so cloudy that you can't even see the stars, you have no idea where you're going. So it was, and for so many days, and they lost hope. 21. So they're just floating out in the middle of the Mediterranean, possibly being pushed into these dangerous shoals here. And then we see what in effect happens is the boat is kind of in this tempest. All of this, they're just kind of pushed along here for 14 days, right here in the middle of the Mediterranean, where you have, the furthest away from land. So they must have felt pretty abandoned. 21, but after long abstinence from food, then Paul stood in the midst of them and said, men, you should have listened to me and not have sailed from Crete and incurred this disaster and loss. So St. Paul says, I told you so. I told you this was going to happen. 22. So he makes the point that, if you look back, I was right. So, but 22, he says, but now I urge you to take heart. So you didn't listen to me then, listen to me now. He's built up some kind of, respect. Listen to me now. I urge you to take heart, for there will be no loss of life among you, but only of the ship. We'll lose the ship. 23, for there stood by me this night an angel of the God to whom I belong and whom I serve, saying, do not be afraid, Paul. You must be brought before Caesar. And indeed, God has granted you all those who sail with you. So we get this sense of, again, going back to our book study, this image of the divine counsel of God. And this angel comes to kind of report to Paul the deliberations of the divine council and says, that God has decided that, he is going to shelter you with his hand because you are called to go and preach the gospel to Caesar. And again, we got to keep thinking of St. Paul. We tend to think of St. Paul as like a modern day rabbi, this kind of man of the book who just spends hours and hours, just reading. And but that's really kind of a misperception of Paul. Paul was really in the mold of the prophets. He was a prophet. All this language about his so-called conversion, everything, it's the call of the prophets. It's this human person is being called into God's service, into his divine counsel, and into his service. And so Paul, we should really think of more as a mystic, as a monk, something like that, rather than as this kind of Presbyterian minister or something like that, a very kind of heady intellectual. I mean, he was that as well, but he has these visions. So I think this is the third vision he has in Acts. All right, so, and it says that, so not only has God decided he's going to protect you, he's listening to your prayers, he's granted you as well those who are traveling with you. Okay, I'm going to save you, and I heard your prayers. I also save those who are traveling with you. 25, therefore take heart, man. This is St. Paul continuing, speaking to the the people on the ship. For I believe God that it will be just as it was told me. However, we must run aground on a certain island. So again, it's this prophetic, the angel has revealed to him a vision of what's going to happen. He's communicating this to them. 27. Now, when the 14th night had come, as we were driven up and down in the Adriatic Sea, about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. Okay, so really, this is the Adriatic Sea now, as we call it. But in antiquity, it kind of extended down into here as well. So they would call this the Adriatic, the Adria. So that's precisely where they were. Now, it's super interesting. There was this Englishman who did all this research about this voyage. So he went and visited all these places. He sailed on all these places. This was like, I think, within the last 100 years or so. He talked with, experienced sailors, etc. Did all these calculations, and it turns out that they've repeated this, that it takes exactly 14 days. I think it was like 13 days and 10 hours to go from here to here, right? And so when St. Paul, when St. Luke records that on the 14th night had come, they had already reached Malta. Now, they didn't know that it was Malta. They didn't know where they were, but that's exactly how long it would have taken. So this is it just kind of goes to prove the veracity of these notes from this travel journal. And about midnight, the sailors sensed that they were drawing near some land. How would they have sensed that? So they then did studies on these ports on Malta and found that they could tell exactly where they're talking about, exactly how the boat would have been pushed by the wind, and because it's typical for sailors even to this day. And that once they reach a certain point near the land, you can hear, maybe even when you're a mile off land, you can hear the breakers. So you can hear the waves hitting the land. So it's midnight, they can't see anything, but they're experienced sailors. And so they start hearing the waves hitting the land. So that's it. They sensed that they were drawing near some land, meaning they heard. 28, and they took soundings and found it to be 20 fathoms. So sounding means they would basically take a heavy object and drop it into the sea and see how much rope was used up. And that's how they could tell how deep it was. So they took it, found it to be 20 fathoms. And when they had gone a little further, they took soundings again and found it to be 15 fathoms. So it's getting more shallow. This also confirms we're coming close to land. 29. Then, and they've actually, so this guy who did this research, he actually measured in all these places, and he's like pretty certain exactly where they were because the measurements match. 29. Then, fearing lest we should run aground on the rocks, they dropped 4 anchors from the stern, from the back, and prayed for day to come. So remember, again, this is in the middle of the night. So they can hear that we're approaching land. They confirm that by dropping the rope, but they can't actually see land. So they say, well, we must be getting really close, and we don't want to be pushed into the rocks. So they put 4 anchors in the back to kind of hold the ship back so that it doesn't go crashing into the land. 30. And as the sailors were seeking to escape from the ship, when they had let down the skiff into the sea, under pretense of putting out anchors from the prow. So in other words, remember again, the skiff, the purpose of the skiff really was to take these anchors away from the ship and set them. So the sailors of the professional crew say, oh yeah, we're going to go set some more anchors. We just set 4. But Paul, 31, figured out what they were really doing. 31, Paul said to the centurion and the soldiers, unless these men stay in the ship, you cannot be saved. So in other words, he knew they were trying to escape, and they're professional sailors. So we kind of need them if we're going to finally have a successful journey. So they need to, if they get off the ship, all's lost. 32, then the soldiers, so not the sailors, the soldiers who are with this guard, cut away the ropes of the skiff and let it fall off. All right, so, I mean, that's kind of, in a way, dangerous because now they don't have use of this skiff, but it also completely removes the temptation for anyone to think about trying to make an escape. So, as these soldiers are lowering down the skiff saying, oh, we're going to go take some more anchors, Paul tells the centurion, bad idea. And the centurion believes him this time. And so the soldiers just cut the ropes, skiff falls and drifts off. 33. And as day was about to dawn, Paul implored them all to take food, saying, "Today is the 14th day you have waited and continued without food and eaten nothing." And so it could be a lot of reasons for this. One, we know they had been throwing some of the cargo overboard, but, that would have been kind of raw wheat. But each person probably would have been responsible for bringing their own food and sustenance with them. We learned that this trip has been much delayed because of the wind. So through some combination, either the amount of time or having to throw things overboard, they're out of food, or maybe they can't, the ship is being pushed all over the place. How can they prepare any food? How can they cook anything? And maybe they're so seasick from these waves they can't eat anything. We don't know. But Paul encourages them, saying to eat. You've waited for 14 days to eat. 34. Therefore, I urge you to take nourishment, for this is for your survival, since not a hair will fall from the head of any of you. This is a Hebrew expression. And when he had said these things, he took bread and gave thanks to God in the presence of them all. And when he had broken it, he began to eat. So a lot of these phrases here are exact phrases, kind of almost technical phrases. He took bread, he gave thanks. So most commentators see here a reference to the Eucharist. So St. Paul is celebrating the Eucharist. Now he would have had with him at least Luke, possibly also Aristarchus, but probably no one else on the ship was Christian. And later he's going to tell us there are 276 people aboard. So, that's interesting. So he has this Eucharist in the early morning, but it's in the presence of them all. Which is kind of interesting. So it's a kind of witness. He began to eat. 36. Then they were all encouraged and also took food themselves. So seeing Paul and perhaps Luke and Aristarchus break bread, give thanks to their God and eat, they also start to eat. They bring out their food. 37. And in all, we were 276 persons on the ship. Now, again, there's extraordinary details here, but I read someone suggested that, it would have been appropriate at that time, since they were going to eat, if they had some fixed supply of bread, let's say, or food, they would need to get an accurate count in order to share it fairly. So that might be why Luke happens to know that exact number at this time. 38. So when they had eaten enough, they lightened the ship and threw out the wheat into the sea. So in other words, Paul gives them courage after this period of 2 weeks of kind of torment and hopelessness and not knowing what's going to happen. Paul now gives them hope and he says, okay, listen to me. It's going to be okay. Here's what's going to happen. We're all going to be fine, but the ship is going to be lost, but we're all going to be fine. And so people were probably hungry for hope at this point. And Paul has this charisma, they follow him. All right, 39. When it was day, they did not recognize the land. So they have no idea where they are. They've just been pushed for 2 weeks. They did not recognize the land, but they observed a bay with a beach onto which they planned to run the ship if possible. So in other words, their plan is there's no port that they can dock in. We're just going to try to run the shore up into the sand, up into the beach. 40. And they let go the anchors and left them in the sea. So remember, they had in the night 4 anchors in the back to keep the wind from pushing them into the land. So now they cut those, they leave them in the sea. So, you get a sense here, they know the situation's desperate. They're not trying to save anything. It's just their lives. Meanwhile, loosing the rudder ropes. So there were like these oars in the water that acted as kind of rudders. Usually they were tied up so they could be fixed. But now they loosen those ropes so that they can have a little bit more steering. And they hoisted the mainsail to the wind and made for shore. So now they put up the sail. Now they want the wind. Push us in. 41. But striking a place where 2 seas meet, they ran the ship aground, and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable. So in other words, without getting too complicated about what they mean by these 2 seas, but in any event, they're trying to head on to shore, but you get this kind of muddy silt buildup because this stream is coming out. And so they kind of run into this muddy silt buildup and get stuck before they hit the shore. The ship ran aground and the prow stuck fast and remained immovable, but the stern was being broken up by the violence of the waves. So it's almost like the front part of the ship gets kind of wedged into this soft clay, this soft mud. It's firmly entrenched, but the end, the kind of butt of the ship is still out in the kind of unprotected area where you get large waves. So the end of the ship's just getting smashed with these waves, and it's being broken up by the violence of the waves. 42. And the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners, lest any of them should swim away and escape. But the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. And the rest, who couldn't swim, some on boards and some on parts of the ship. In other words, they should just, if you can't swim, grab onto some board that's been knocked loose from the ship, grab one and float onto land. And so it was that they all escaped safely to land. So all 276, just as Paul had kind of prophesied, as had been revealed to him by God, all 276 are rescued and land on Malta. All right. Any questions there? I guess the only one thing here was the soldiers' plan was to kill the prisoners. So the soldiers would have been responsible for delivering these prisoners. And like, remember in Philippi, remember when Paul and Silas are kind of miraculously freed of their chains in the jail in Philippi, and when the jailer sees that what he thinks that there's been a mass escape, he goes to kill himself because he was responsible. So he would be killed by his superiors for negligence. Here, the soldiers are equally worried about making a wrong move, but because these are condemned prisoners, for them, it's better, well, okay, we didn't bring them all the way, but we can't just let them escape. They're condemned criminals, so we have to kill them, execute them. But the centurion says no, basically for the sake of Paul, that they must be kept. Again, a very positive image of the centurion. All right. So you guys see here on the map where we are here. So they end up all the way over here in Malta, and here's Rome up here. All right. Any questions? Comments? Concerns?
Father, I think that was the best lesson you've ever given, as far as I'm concerned. Because the details you've given, I've read that before, but of course I couldn't possibly imagine the details of the ship coming towards Malta and all the details you gave us. I think that's fabulous, and I'm one that loves details and retains them, as I try to anyway. And so I think that was excellent.
Thank you. Yeah, I try to, I'm always trying to get in. I love studying, especially New Testament, because I'm trying to kind of picture it. I'm trying to imagine, like, realistically in their historical context, what was going on. What were the cultures like? What did it look like? How did they understand what was happening to them?
And just the conditions of the sea. And I mean, if you've ever tried to go on a ferry across the waters in Greece in late October, you get a little bit of an appreciation of what, they faced. And I know when we used to sail a little bit in the Sound down near Pensacola and Destin, and you had to be careful just in the Sound to have good winds, because otherwise you were moving your sails, you were tacking just to make a little distance up the waterway. And my goodness, no wonder it took them so long going against the western winds.
Yeah.
Just unbelievable.
I think it's interesting, the symbolism, to really try to remember how the ancients would have viewed the sea. If you think about it, in the Greek pantheon, the Greek Roman pantheon, you had Zeus, Hades, and Poseidon. Those were the three most powerful gods. Poseidon, of course, is the god of the sea. So, the sea was this very powerful force, malevolent almost. And that, a lot of times there's this whole genre around the time of the New Testament here in the Hellenistic world of this literature, that, it was almost like, I don't know, we have our own genres now in movies, like a thriller, an action film, etc. But in the Hellenistic literature, there was these tales of the sea and shipwrecks were kind of part of, people were interested in reading about this. So all these details would have been, for Luke's readers, they would have been salivating over all these details, imagine this, and it's almost like this cosmic battle between good and evil, because they would, in the Hellenistic literature, they would see all of these things happening as kind of the works of this evil God who is trying to thwart God's purpose for Paul.
It's like the story of Ulysses. The story of Ulysses.
I was just going to say this very same thing. Poseidon is a very bad dude in the Odyssey.
But
very bad.
But here, what's being presented is that the God of Paul has power even over him. So.
It's fascinating to me. It's fascinating to me to be able to think of these people, being guided by the stars. I mean, I have GPS and still get lost. It blows me away that the intelligence of these people fascinates me continuously through, especially when you are able to give so much research on, that it's true. I mean, these people have even tried to do it the same route, and it takes the same amount of day. I mean, it is very helpful to have all of your insight there too.
It's sad that we're losing a lot of that knowledge that they had in those days because of the new technology. I don't think many sailors can sail now through the seas by the stars anymore.
No.
They might not have that knowledge, but in those days they did.
And they won't measure the fathoms because they have the sound, the sonar. So
we're losing a lot of that knowledge. It's sad in a way because of the technology that we have today. But it's fascinating. But, even in the Word of God, it says that he created the stars to navigate the seas, for man to navigate the seas. It's all written in there in the Old Testament. Yeah. So it's very, very interesting.
Father, thank you for giving us those nice word pictures. Really.
Yes.
And I did listen to your podcast. I wasn't here when you did the lesson on the book club, and I was listening to it all morning, and I was fascinated with what you said then, and about the council of the gods up there, the invisible part versus, and I've always said, that if we could imagine when we walk in church that we are in the presence of the council of God, that when in a holy presence, that we would be a lot more in awe of where we are, because we are joining the triumphal church, and if we could just imagine the invisible always before us, it would be so much more reverent, the situation, and we'd be in awe.
Father, I'm interested in where you got all the details about the sailing. I mean, where did you do that research?
So there's I have a bunch of commentaries. I'm constantly collecting resources and commentaries, most of which now are electronic. That's the way I've gone. When I first started this, it was mostly actual books, but now I've moved really all to a digital library, and these programs are able to kind of pull together hundreds of resources and allow you to filter the information. So basically these books that have been digitized that I've bought, and then you can just, they'll all correlate. So you say Acts 27, it'll give you all the resources there are on Acts 27. So there's commentaries. The nautical information doesn't, it comes from one of the commentaries where they incorporated a lot of this guy's findings. I think his name was James Smith, who wrote this book just about this voyage.
Then you just do a little data search on a topic, and I bet you just come up with all kinds of little nuggets.
Most of them are in the form of commentaries, so already from different angles. So usually I'll just read, like for today, I'll just read all the commentaries I can find on chapter 27. Some are better than others. Depends on you know, what you're trying to focus on. But I always try to read also the fathers. There's a compilation of commentaries from the fathers, so that, you know, we stay close to the church's interpretation and teaching. But,
well, thanks.
Thank you, Father.
Thanks for joining me. So next week I'm going to be at the camp. So I guess in 2 weeks we'll meet, and we should be able to knock out chapter 28, and then we can kind of turn our attention to what we want to do in the fall. I'm already thinking. I keep, something keeps telling me I want to do 1 Corinthians after this. But we'll see. But and then we need to decide, do we want to get back together in person or what we want to do. So all right, think about it.
Okay. Thank you, Father.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.